well. All right, now transition. We knew when we were planning the conference that we wanted to focus a plenary on Iran, not a surprise. We also knew that it was a moving target. So for months we've been saying, what are we going to do on Iran? What do you want to do on Iran? At one point, we contacted two of the lead Iranian negotiators who we know and said, hey, you guys want to come to the Carnegie conference and talk? And this gave us some indication. They said, we probably won't be available then. They were right. We talked about US officials talking about this issue. They also said they wouldn't be available, but if it wasn't done, weren't going to talk about it. So we gradually focused on the Congress, in particular the Senate. And our interest in that grew with the dissemination of a letter by 47 of our senators to the Supreme Leader of Iran. Thought this would be great to talk about. And so we went about securing the participation of one of the leaders in the Republican Party who didn't sign the letter and who's been a very engaged and open leader on this topic, and he was interested to do it. And then, as we had announced at the end of last week, Senator Tim Kaine, who's the ranking minority member in the Foreign Relations Committee and the subcommittee on the Middle East, agreed to be here. And so the idea was we were going to have a conversation with them. Subsequently, it's turned out, as often happens with the Senate, that they are voting now. And you don't win re-election for the Senate if you miss votes, because then your opponent runs commercials taking pictures of you at a conference like this, hanging out with people like you, rather than voting on the behalf of their constituents back home. So as a consequence, both senators are up on the Hill voting. And what I propose we do, don't worry, we've moved up the reception so you'll get drinks sooner than had been previously planned. And I also understand that if I were standing over there rather than here, I'd be a dead man by now due to the stampede to the bar. But what we thought we would do is at least have kind of a group discussion about Iran, asking you and discussing amongst ourselves some of the questions that I was going to ask the senators. Because on a lot of these issues, at least I feel it's similar to the discussion, the session that we just had. These are highly debatable propositions that your policy, in a way, depends upon. So what I'm going to suggest is I will raise some of these questions, and we'll basically just have a discussion. We have a number of the volunteers whom I had thanked and whom you had thanked earlier around. So we've got a lot of microphones, and we can do this in a pretty efficient way. So the first question that I was going to ask the senators, but now I will ask you all, do any of you think that it is feasible to motivate Iran to accept an agreement that allows them to do no enrichment? Does anybody think that that's feasible? Because if you do, seriously, then we want to understand and take us through how that would work. Somebody must think it's. If that many people in the U.S. Senate think that that should be our position, it's very interesting that nobody here thinks it is. Okay, but that's useful and helpful, but that isn't the position that. What's that?
2,000 military assets before, because if you don't bomb them, they would restart it. So, it would never work. Okay. And I think even with the sanctions, you can do that, so it's no way.
Okay, because the proposition, whether it was the Prime Minister of Israel or others on the Hill, is not that you get them to accept zero enrichment by bombing them. It's that they agree. Ellie. Okay, if anybody can come up with this, it'll be he, but let's see.
At the beginning of the negotiations, the Iranian had floated ideas that there would be some kind of a consortium on their territory. So it would not be indigenous Iranian production exclusively in some fashion and so on. So if you ask me, should the position have been, now in retrospect, that rather than allowing an indigenous Iranian production of say, 6,000 or whatever it is, to accept an international consortium that enriches on their territory, I would have gone for that arrangement. And so I think that what we miss out is by framing it as an Iranian indigenous one versus of zero, as distinguished from an international consortium.
But it's March 24th, and depending on how you count the deadline, it's either March 31st or July 1st or whatever. So has that opportunity passed?
The question is whether one can actually talk about an evolution, where you would say, okay, 6,000 we tolerated, but at the stage where you want to scale it up to 60,000, it can no longer remain Iranian.
Okay, but and that's a different proposition.
But that's not in the discussion.
Right. No, great. Okay. So that was, see, he's creative. Okay, so there weren't a lot of takers on that, which is interesting because that isn't. I mean, there's a widely felt position on the Hill that really is the benchmark and the standard is no enrichment. There's legislation saying basically that a deal that allows any enrichment won't be acceptable in the U.S. So that's interesting. On the question of verification, and there are a lot of verification experts here, so there's a piece of it that I wanted to ask about, and maybe we can get a discussion. I think it's fairly well understood what would be desirable and probably necessary in terms of access in Iran. In particular, to build confidence that there would not be undeclared facilities. All right? The question that I think has been a struggle, and it's harder, maybe people here know how to answer it, is how do you simultaneously get the discretion, the opportunity, the permission, as it were, to have that kind of inspections regime, and reassure the Iranians that there will be some kind of due process. In other words, it won't be a constant fishing expedition, intelligence gathering expedition, an unending process of saying, okay, now we want to go here, now we want to go there, a kind of constant process. Because that's one of the concerns that they have is, if it's unending and there's no kind of rule to guide the process of deciding when and where you get to go, what country would accept that? So do people have an idea about how you could meet both of those interests? The international interests for lots of access to lots of places, including potentially military facilities, and an Iranian and other countries' interest in having some kind of due process. Are there any analogies? What do people who work on verification? Ed Levine. Microphone. Thank you. Thanks, Lauren.
You could build a little bit of ambiguity into the verification scheme by saying the IAEA had unlimited rights, but would be expected to exercise those rights in a manner that did not unnecessarily impede and fill in the blank. And you have a joint commission to which Iran could take its concerns if the IAEA were inspecting in too much of a random and impeding basis. Now, that would not give them much because they would probably lose anything where push came to shove, but it would give them the opportunity to complain, march, and chowder.
Okay. Thoughts on that? Did people get that? Does anybody know, has anybody leaked kind of what's being thought of about this? This is one of those topics that, with all of the focus on enrichment, there hasn't been much, at least public discussion on this, and I know it's super important. Does anybody who won't go to jail for telling us have an idea, or be prosecuted, if not go to jail, Anybody got more of a sense? I mean, Ed has an idea. Anything else on this? Yes, Mustafa.
Hi, this is Mustafa Kibaroglu from MEF University, Istanbul. I've been studying Iran's nuclear program for the last 20 years, and I've written extensively on the issue. And I believe, including your first question, there are two precedents. One is the EU3 process back in 2003, 2005, and also there's this so-called notorious the Tehran Declaration thing. The latter of which was a confidence-building measure, a deal cut with the work of Turkey, Brazil, and of course Iran, which aim at building confidence, and that would be followed by several other steps that have not been mentioned in the text of the declaration, but through my conversations with people who were involved in the process, that more was to come, including putting a cap on enrichment at a later stage and soon to be followed, not in far into far distant future. So Iranians, well, by the way, I can say this quite publicly because I have written extensively, as I said, that I personally believe that Iran wants to have the bomb. But they're also clever enough not to take any step further at the time when they are already being treated as if they had nuclear weapons already. Not only that they are being treated as a high class, prestigious state, P5+1 negotiations, but also they are being really scared. The Gulf countries in the region, they're scared to death seeing Iran advancing its capabilities. So what would they gain by weaponizing their capabilities? They will probably be punished if they did this, but they will gain by staying at the threshold level or maybe close to the threshold. So as has been the case with the EU3 experience back in 2003-2005 period, and also which was the only text that I know of course, that included Iran's signature on it since the beginning of the millennium, which in my opinion, the declaration was a wasted effort, but one was an important effort. So Iran may be provided, Iran may agree to some conditions provided that they are taken more serious and they are given more roles in the geopolitical
But that's a different issue, Mustafa. That's an issue about the logic of why they would do something or uphold it. But I think what we're clear about, at least here, but I think internationally, is this is going to be based on distrust and verified.
Let me finish by saying, George, that they allowed verification during this 2003-2005 process, and also with respect to the Parchin, military base, they said one facility, one-time inspection, and they allowed the IAEA people. Well, of course, maybe at a time when there was nothing to be, found there. So I think this, you mentioned if there's an analogy, if there's a precedent, I believe these are the two cases where some people can draw some lessons for the future.
Thanks. There's a lady who I can't see, but I saw her hand. There you go. Yeah.
Yes, Laura Rockwood. Yeah.
You come up here, and
As you might imagine, George. I've heard this idea of a supra commission, a joint commission, that might be put in place that would second-guess the IAEA's verification. I would propose that is extremely counterproductive. If what you want is an IAEA that is technically credible, supported by its member state, and not to be second-guessed by a political body. And as an example of where it worked very well was 2003 and Iraq. Now, it certainly wasn't the IAEA's fault that the world went to hell in a handbasket. So I don't think imposing a super commission above the IAEA's technical judgment is a good idea. And in fact, I think it is a counterproductive and bad idea in the long term.
Okay,
Not to put too fine a point on it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. It does. It's like, and it's always helpful what not to do, because I think people have been tempted by that idea. But then we're still any more. Bob Einhorn, thank you.
A lot of people talk about anywhere, anytime inspections. That's happened once. It happened in the case of a country that was defeated on the battlefield. That was Iraq in the first Gulf War. The results was Security Council Resolution 687, created the IAEA action team in UNSCOM. You had a number of alpha males who were in charge of inspecting Iraq. And they really, it was no notice, we're breaking in the doors and so forth. If a country hasn't been defeated in the battlefield, you're not going to get those kind of inspection rights. And we know that the IRGC has been opposed to inspectors having access to military installations. Now, any agreement that prevented inspectors from going to military installations would be, unacceptable by any of the P5+1 countries. There are a number of precedents that can be drawn upon. There is the additional protocol and its complementary access, which does provide access to military installations if there's a reason to go there. There's a CWC, which has some, intrusive verification. My own view, and I agree with Laura that nobody should substitute for the IAEA. They have great expertise in the nuclear area. But this should be a sui generis inspection regime. I think it has to meet particular needs in a country that has a rather checkered track record in terms of compliance. I think it has to be very, very robust, but there are managed access arrangements that have been employed by a number of different inspection organizations. In the US, Russia, US, Soviet arms control experience, you have incredibly intrusive verification arrangements. You can take off the top of nose cones of missiles and count warheads. They may be shrouded with different kinds of Kansas
But that's
canvas.
reciprocal, though, so
That's reciprocal, and so it's more difficult. And Iran is loath to go well beyond inspection arrangements that other countries are unwilling to accept. It's prepared to do the additional protocol. It's probably prepared to go beyond the additional protocol. It's not prepared to say beyond the additional protocol. It'll say, we're accepting a broad interpretation of the additional protocol. But I think this is one of the things that if there is a political framework worked out by the end of this month, one of the things that's going to take a lot of time is working out these inspection arrangements by the end of June. But my own view is don't grab a model from some convention, establish a sui generis approach that has no part of Iran off limits, although allows Iran to conceal items that are genuinely sensitive and not related to the subject matter of this agreement.
Thanks. Any other ideas on this? And partly I belabor it, and Bob made a reference. I mean, he talked about the framework agreement or comprehensive agreement, whose deadline was either yesterday or 31st, or I don't know any other definitions of it. But then there's supposed to be the technical negotiations thereafter. And I think insofar as the U.S. Congress is going to be important in this process, and I think if Senator Corker and Senator Kaine had been here, they both would have said Congress is going to have to play a role. So it's not just Senator Corker who has a bill to this effect, but Senator Kaine, the Democrat, has also taken that position. They're definitely going to fixate on verification. And it's a little hard to imagine how any verification would be sufficient for some of them. And so this is going to be a really, really difficult issue that we generally haven't focused on. So Bob has an approach that he outlined. Laura cautioned us on what not to do. Any others have been thinking hard about this particular issue? Let's see. Okay, well, I'm sure when we debate it in the Congress, you will be provoked to think about it some more, and so look forward to that. Another issue that's come up is duration. We heard the Prime Minister of Israel, we've heard other people say, sunset clause, what's that? How could this lapse? It needs to be forever, or at least as long as there's the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they haven't changed their government. So a rather narrower question for this expert group is, does anybody have a basis for demanding an indefinite agreement, or an agreement that doesn't have a boundary in time? Is there a basis in the NPT that anybody sees, or UN Security Council resolutions? There are lots of experts here on this. What would you anchor a demand that it be forever or unending on? Or is there not a basis for that? Anybody? Yes, sir. There it is, right behind you.
Thank you. I think that we are constantly increasing the demands for non-nuclear weapon states. We see that initially we got a treaty like the NPT, where the non-nuclear weapon states agreed to undertake some obligations, and they were given some rights like disarmament and peaceful cooperation. But over the time, we see that there have been increased obligations. We see that initially they had to undertake comprehensive safeguards, and later there was Zanger Committee, and then the NSG, and then additional protocol, and then 1540. But on the other hand, we see that the rights have not increased. Even the rights which were promised at that time have not been conferred to them. So I think there's a disbalance here. All the states should try to incentivize for the non-nuclear weapon states to abide by their obligations, because it appears that it has always been coercive. They have been forced into taking more obligations without the rights being delivered or confirmed.
Okay, but in this case, I'm going to go to Mark Fitzpatrick, but in this case, Iran was found non-compliant with its obligations. So I think they're two separate conversations. They'll get merged maybe in the NPT at some point. So you identify an important issue, but I think on the Iran issue, it's also a compliance issue. Mark, on this.
Yeah, I have argued in the past that rather than an arbitrary deadline, the sunset clause should have been based on a logical conclusion by the IAEA regarding the additional protocol, that if the IAEA could draw the broad conclusions, that would have been the basis for there no longer being doubt and suspicion about non-peaceful nuclear activity in Iran. Now, you asked any basis for an indefinite. One of the reasons I liked this additional protocol broad conclusion criterion is that as long as there were suspicions, as long as member states were presenting evidence about activity, the IAEA would find it hard to draw that conclusion. And there might be states that have a whole pocket full of evidence that they could dole out. And that's precisely, I guess, why Iran rejected this idea, because it might, in fact, be indefinite in practice.
Although you can imagine game theorists or smarter people figuring out, like if you pull out one of those chits of an allegation and it doesn't come through, then they get like speeded up a year. So you create an incentive in both directions to game. Any others on the duration issue? Yes, Emily.
Hi.
That's Emily Landau.
Yes, Emily Landau from the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Many of the things that are being discussed now, or what we know is being discussed now in these negotiations, is they don't have a referent back into the NPT. I mean, the whole problem here is that when there are cases of noncompliance, the NPT doesn't give answers. It says it goes to the Security Council for sanctions, and that's it. This whole negotiation is something that is being created as the P5+1 go along. I totally do not understand the sunset provision in general, because the key to this negotiation is exposing the clear violation of Iran of the NPT. And the violation is its work on military aspects of its nuclear program. And until the P5+1 in their negotiation bring the weaponization aspect clearly to the table and undercut Iran's narrative, according to which it has done no wrong in the nuclear realm, there's no explanation for this sunset provision. You have a sunset provision if you have any degree of confidence that Iran has made a strategic U-turn in the nuclear realm, that it has backed away from its military aspirations. But until you bring that into the conversation, until you squarely confront Iran with the evidence of its wrongdoing, until you say to Iran, no, you have done wrong in the nuclear realm, and you know what? That's why we're having these negotiations. That's why we're demanding all of these things, because you cannot be trusted, because you have violated. So to have a sunset provision until you get those answers makes absolutely no sense, because at the end of 10 years, Iran will conceivably go back to what it was doing before the deal.
But, so if they quote came clean or did what you said, they could do that in a year, and they're whole again, and so they go on about the deal, right?
No,
so it could be a one-year deal.
No, it's not about making a confession so that then everything goes back to normal.
Right.
It's about exposing the fact that Iran's narrative is in fact incorrect, that Iran has been lying and cheating and deceiving the international community for years and years,
Right.
that it has lost the trust of the international community, and that until it builds that up and shows that it has made a strategic U-turn in the nuclear realm, that these provisions will continue.
But that's the idea, and what's being negotiated says this is how you build confidence that you've made a U-turn and that we will have confidence that you no longer intend or would develop nuclear weapon capability, and when you accomplish those things and we can verify it, then we'll feel that that was done. So I don't, your argument, I don't get how that leads to indefinite. It suggests there should be criteria by which they address the concerns that you have, but it's hard to see that that's...
It's not addressing the concerns, it's making it clear that they've made the strategic U-turn,
right.
just like Syria did back in 2013. We know when a state has made the strategic U-turn and when it has not. And when Iran continues with the narrative that it has done no wrong, obviously it has not made that strategic U-turn.
Okay. This gentleman here and then Sinan, yeah.
Thank you. Timothy Stafford from RUSI. My suggestion here is you finesse the indefinite issue by treating this like an arms control treaty, where the treaty remains in place indefinitely, but both parties, or the parties, the signatories, have notification of withdrawal from 6 months. So then Iran could say, well, this is not an indefinite treaty, we can withdraw any time that we want, but the international community would have some assurance because A, it would get notification, and B, there'd have to be some justification for withdrawing.
I think, first of all, we're not talking about a treaty, but secondly, I think one of the issues is at least the Iranian, call it a desire, backed by other countries, that at some point they be treated as a normal state under the NPT, in which case they wouldn't, in their view, be constrained by, for example, how much fuel cycle activity they get. Now, you could negotiate, and we would argue you should negotiate, that activity should be commensurate to actual need for reactor fuel and so on. But the idea you're talking about of maintaining those kind of constraints, some of them they want, at least in principle, not to have after a certain point. So I think that would be tricky. Sinan on this.
One idea would be to embed UN Security Council from the start. And now how that would work is you have a number of predefined years, 10 years, 15 years. And after, if you want to continue, if the international community wants to continue with the intrusive process, you basically mandate the IAEA to produce an assessment of what they've seen so far. And then the UN Security Council gets to vote on whether the extension will be possible or not. Because then, the P5 have the ability to veto, and it basically boils down to whether Russia and China will block the extension where there is evidence that there is still some vagueness about Iran's program. So if you have enough confidence that Russia and China will not block this, then basically you get to a mechanism whereby you can extend the duration of the intrusive inspection for as long as there is unanimity among the P5.
So and this is consistent in a way, and process-wise, with what Emily's saying. It's rooted in the Security Council, basically, and so it's the Security Council's judgment how to base this. And there are resolutions at the Security Council. Bob, coming back to you. And then I have one last question, Jessica Matthews. And then one last question, and we're going to go drink. Go ahead.
Look, we can hypothesize anything we want. We can have Emily's U-turn confession. We could have Mark's broad conclusion by the IEA. We could have Sinan's UN Security Council, the last one that concedes that the agreement is over. And none of this less than 15 years minimum. I mean, you can put all these things together, but none of this is going to happen. I mean, they're already negotiating on duration. They may well have reached agreement on duration. And I think the key issue now is whether there should be a single fixed duration, whether it's 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, or whether various provisions should have different durations. The additional protocol, which apparently Iran is prepared to sign up to, should be permanent. Members who join the additional protocol, they sign up, forever. There should be other things that hopefully would last longer than whatever the fixed duration is. Maybe, if there's agreement during duration, they can't enrich above 5%. Maybe that should continue indefinitely. Or maybe if there's a prohibition on reprocessing or having facilities capable of reprocessing for the duration, maybe that should extend beyond. So I'm sure they're looking at various durations for various kinds of provisions, and I hope it's as long as possible. But unfortunately, I think we're beyond the point where we can say, okay, this agreement stays in force until Iran makes a full confession, which it's not going to do because of its religious edict against having nuclear weapons. It's not going to make that confession, and I don't think we can really expect it.
Right. Great. Jessica, and then one last question. Yep.
Well, I was going to make the same point that Bob just made, that we oughtn't to think of it as one date, and that the obvious way to negotiate a difference between 10 years and 20 years is to have a whole series of ending dates for different aspects of the agreement. Secondly, I think it's tremendously important to confront sooner rather than later this question of a public confession. We know from the period when we were negotiating seriously with North Korea that we would be in a period of making significant progress with them, and then we would come to the point where we'd say, now tell us what you did before the diversion, and they'd play 52-card pickup. Just throw their arms in the air, and the talks would break down. And it happened over and over and over again. I think the question will be for the world, do we care more about the past or do we care more about the future? And we know what we know about what happened in the past. A public confession seems to me to be terribly unwise obsession as a criterion of success.
Well,
can I just make one other key point?
Yeah.
I think Congress has, and maybe also we have in thinking about this, begun to think about the beginning of the 11th year, the first day of the 11th year, as the day after tomorrow, and forgotten that there's 10 years to work on this in the interim, and that there are a whole number of steps that could be achieved in that 10 years that go beyond. All of the discussion has been what happens if Iran falls short, and what can be added on in terms of punishment. But there is, and there's plenty of reason in Iran's past history to think that way. But there is also a reason to be thinking about what you can build on this as well.
Yeah, thank you. We're talking about different things in a way, because there's one discussion which is negotiating with Iran, and then the other discussion is negotiating with the Congress. And I think that's where the duration issue comes up, because Bob's right. It's been settled, in a sense, within the negotiation that there's going to be several different breaks, but that it has a duration. The problem is getting people in Congress to understand that. That leads me to my last question, and it may be Bob that has an answer to that, because it's about sanctions. And the question is this: if the P5+1 come to an agreement with Iran, both in terms of a comprehensive framework in the nearer term, and then a much more difficult thing, which we underestimate here, actually working out the details. And those details, you know, what gets us to July 1 or what have you. And the P5+1 are satisfied with those. And at that point, something happens in Washington to make it look very unlikely that the US would be able to deliver its part of an agreement in terms of sanctions relief. So if that happened, basically, and you got the P5+1 and Iran agreeing, and then something happens in Washington, my question is, would it be possible to maintain the international sanctions regime that has been in place in the last 3 or 4 years and is widely credited with getting Iran to the table in the first place? Can you maintain sanctions if that's what happens? Let me ask it this way. Does anybody think that you could maintain sanctions if that's what happens? Yes, sir. Please, you're a brave man. I really appreciate it.
I'll give it a stab.
Good.
Bidwell from Federation of American Scientists.
Oh, great.
I'm doing some thinking on this. Sanctions work if they got to have a common denominator. They work if they're international in scope. You see the Cuba sanctions where it's a U.S. only, you have a failure policy. You see the current economic sanctions, and I'm only talking about banking and insurance sanctions here. You need consensus. You need businesses are making a calculated risk. Too risky to do business with Iran right now because of the threats that I may suffer in New York. And so if the rest of the European companies, not countries, but companies, decide it's not safe to go back into Iran yet, they won't. And you can't make them go. Even if you waive the sanctions, you can't make them go. So it's more of an issue of the consensus, not just in Washington, but amongst our European and Asian allies.
Does that, and I'm really glad you raised that, but does that raise another issue? Let me not be coy. To my mind, that raises another issue, which is a strategic issue for the United States, of how long could the United States get away with imposing those kinds of sanctions that where we're legally entitled. We say, look, you want to have your neutrons come through, your electrons come through, you know, our territory, you got to do what we tell you to. And at some point, does the rest of the world start mobilizing, saying, you know what, we'll start dealing with other currencies, we'll create other, like what's happening now with development banks. We heard Kevin Rudd talk about, you know, trading partners, and we're trying to, so is that a limiting asset?
It's a limiting asset, and it's a risk, but I don't think we're quite there yet to a new world currency or anything like that. Now, that is a risk, and that is a possibility, but I think it's, at this point in time, given all that's going on, it's a remote possibility.
So Iran could still be squeezed, and then people would start thinking, we're not going to let that happen again.
Slightly squeezed. If you squeeze too hard, if you get ahead of the rest of the international community, if you get tougher sanctions, the whole thing crumbles, in my humble opinion.
Other views on this? Yes.
Hi, my name is Farzan Sabet. I'm a visiting fellow at Georgetown, visiting from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. I was just going to say that obviously the current sanctions regimes has two components. One is the international coalition, and the other is kind of the financial and economic instruments the U.S. has fashioned, and its willingness to use them coercively and extraterritorially. So even if at some point, and just based on my experience talking with banks and various financial institutions in Geneva, even if the, let's say, deal doesn't happen and is partially blamed on the U.S., if the international coalition does collapse, I still think the U.S. would be able to carry out the sanctions regimes in part. Perhaps it wouldn't be as powerful as when it had the consensus, but I think it would still be able to move forward with it because the coercive kind of element of the sanctions work, especially on private sector entities.
Anybody else on this? Bob. Bob Einhorn spent many, many hours, but he got like 1K status. No, you got global services. Going around getting countries to sign up for these sanctions. So he was like the traveling dentist, going to people to drill. And so anybody who's entitled to have a view on this, it's he.
Thank you, George, for that introduction. Let's spin out this scenario you're talking about. Okay, Corker has this bill that says once there's a comprehensive deal, within 5 days, it goes to the Congress. Congress has 60 days. During that period, it could pass a joint resolution of disapproval. What that would do would be essentially to eliminate the president's waiver authority. Okay, so you have a situation where the P5+1 and Iran have reached an agreement that our partners think it's, a good deal. They wouldn't have signed up, for it. But the president can no longer implement that deal. We have to renege on that deal.
Right.
He no longer has the authority to suspend sanctions under the deal. Okay, so we can, at that point, decide we're going to continue to implement our national sanctions. And we can say to China and India and South Korea and Japan and South Africa, okay, if you insist on continuing to buy crude oil from Iran, we're going to cut, whatever financial institution is facilitating that purchase, we're going to cut that institution out from the American financial system. We can do that legally. That's what we've threatened to do. Up until now, all of these partners have gone along. One, because they don't want to be cut off from the U.S. financial system, but also because they thought Iran was the intransigent party. And they joined us in wanting to exert greater leverage on Iran for a more flexible negotiating position. But in a situation where we have signed off, the U.S. administration has signed off, and they have signed off, on a deal, and then clearly we are unilaterally reneging on the deal, I think it becomes very hard. Now, does it drop off immediately? Probably no. I mean, there are a lot of banks who, even on those circumstances, are not going to want to get involved with Iran and so forth. But, soon you're going to have a China or an India or someone defying on us and saying, the hell with you, we're going to buy crude oil, or we're going to engage with this sanctioned Iranian bank and so forth. And then, sanctions will begin to erode over time, and then we will be forced into very tough choices. Are we going to sanction major Chinese and Indian and Japanese banks or tolerate the erosion of sanctions? And it's a very difficult situation. Sanctions will not drop off the cliff suddenly, but they will erode, and fairly quickly.
You get the last word, ma'am, because then we're going to go.
I have to get the last word because I'm the coordinator of the Iran panel on sanctions of the UN.
Oh, geez.
So I had to say something.
It's like, thank you. It's like there's a God or something.
And I want to say that we would enter a very dangerous situation in which the legitimacy of the system, how it has worked until now, and which has brought us to maybe a solution of a comprehensive agreement, would be destroyed by this US going completely unilateral. Whereas until now, the strength of the system has been built on universality, maybe soft universality, without the type of really biting measures like the US has in its own hands, or sometimes the EU with swift sanctions. But it was really the fact that you had universality plus that worked. And universality we have seen when implementing the sanctions, that practically no state has ever dared to challenge the sanctions, even when we knew that they were not that enthusiastic or that convinced. That will be destroyed, and that is a very big challenge for the future, for the Security Council, legitimacy, credibility, and for the system of sanctions. So that's a choice.
Thank you for raising your hand, and thank you for enlightening us about that. Well, we'll all stay tuned, not just to the negotiations, but then I think the real fun will start in this town. And so for those of you who are resident, you won't be able to escape it. For those of you who are visitors, enjoy. It should be quite interesting. Thank you all again for coming to the conference and for being such great colleagues in all of this. And now the reception is across the way.
Wait.
Not quite. Toby Dalton.
Almost. If you've borrowed an iPad and you don't wish to purchase it, I suggest you return it. Secondly, as I started yesterday by noting, we've tried to do a little bit of innovation for this conference. We've moved location, we had the app, we did the polling, and now we have a survey. It was part of the app. It will also come to you by email, and we'd love to hear from you. We try to make this conference the best it is possible for the community, and so we would really appreciate your suggestions. Now the bar is open.
Thank you.